we understood and found out that that this task force actually has launched a similar survey. And so we have pulled back on our plan to launch a survey so that there's no duplicate efforts there. Once the survey that's linked to this effort, to your effort, expires or ends, then we will ramp ours back up. That's all I have for you, Mr. Chair.
And thank you. And just to Barlow yesterday, they were going to form a working group that would then evaluate, instead of the current statute, something that was correct, more of a, not an open sandbox so much as a specific sandbox that had more strings and legislative oversight. They are looking at potential dates between now and the session, but then the other question is, can we come up with a bill that'll get 2/3 introductory vote and work it far enough along so that it's in prime time for that? The answer to that, I think, is still up in the air. Mind the group that as we go through these bills today, the draft bills that are out there, the process is that we then at some point, this working group hands off the bill to a committee in order to introduce it. And so if the committee itself, for example, corporations, is not overly excited about taking one of the bills we come up with, unless we can work the bills to the point where they're satisfactory to those committees, we're kind of spinning our wheels because if it's not going to get launched out of a committee, we don't want to waste our time on it. So we're kind of working hand in hand. We'll do that with the Ag Committee as well. For some of the bills we worked today, we'll do that with the Minerals Committee. We'll talk about that more this afternoon, but I've spoken with the House Chair of Minerals, and I think that they're inclined to take up the bills that would come out of here. And they have one more meeting this year. I believe it's in November, as we work through these. And then once again, just to remind this work group as well, that the co-chairs and I have put together a letter that has gone to Management Council. And in that letter, we expressed the desire that this working group continue through the next biennium. And the point of that is that just take the housing issues, for example. We're a long way from fully understanding all of the issues that are involved there and taking a deeper dive on those type of issues. And the bills that we're not fully comfortable with between now and the end of either this committee meeting or if we have one more, but we still want to work and have further discussion on, more public comment. We want to be able to carry on and take the information that we've gleaned in the last 6 or 7 months through after session next year. And so just for everyone that has that kind of in the back of their minds of how we're going to proceed through today and the work that we're doing. And the door is still open for any new ideas or suggestions that this committee on any of on the agriculture, energy side or housing sides comes up with that we can continue to work and digest. And the more we can get done between now and session, the more we can hit the ground running after session as this committee moves on. And so just keep that in mind as we kind of walk through this processes today. And it may, we're still in a large degree in an information taking phase of this committee. Part of what we'll do tomorrow is taking in a lot of information on the housing side with different points of view on issues with Teton County and then the county commissioners and the like. So with that, any other questions for Chad regarding the sandbox concept or ideas? All right, Chad, we'll be in touch again. I'm sorry.
Sounds good.
Continue
Thank
on.
you,
Anything else, Chad?
That's it. Thank you.
Okay. Next, we're going to jump right to our second topic, agriculturally working group updates. And Doug, I think you have the floor for that. You can stay there, or you can go off to the mic, whatever is convenient for you.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good morning, members of the task force. It's great to be here. It's good to have an opportunity to discuss these issues just as a group. It seems like, particularly when it's come to the topic of meat processing over the past several years, We've answered a lot of individual questions, inquiries from other legislators and from the public generally about how our program works and what we've been up to. And so what I can report to you this morning is that, through the work of this task force, we might have identified some ways in which we think the Department of Ag can help a little bit better with new processing. This is something that has not been common for the Department of Agriculture. We've never seen this level of pressure to increase processing as we have in the last 4 or 5 years. That's a fairly new phenomena. Coming into my time at the Department of Agriculture, we didn't have any federal meat plants operating in the state of Wyoming, and today there's 12 of those. We've been able to increase our processing capacity anywhere from 40 to 50% over the past several years. So we've seen very impressive growth in that sector for the state of Wyoming. That's a good thing to see. But then the question also comes up a lot, particularly when we're talking about topics surrounding food freedom. Where are the flexibilities in the meat program, and what can the Department of Ag do? How do we work with our counterparts at USDA? So this morning I thought I'd take an opportunity. I had an individual question that came up after the last task force meeting that there was an inquiry about where are the flexibilities with meat? What could we do with our program for flexibility? Where's the edge of that flexibility? So my counterpart, Justin Latham, he's the manager of our Consumer Health Services Division. We've been doing some research and asking some questions with our partners at USDA to see, what can we do? And so I included in your packet, there's a couple different handouts there. And one of them talks about the different exemptions that are available under the Federal Meat Inspection Act that do provide some flexibility, and they provide some exemptions to existing regulations. And so the way this works is that Wyoming is one of 27 states that have delegated authority from USDA, Food Safety Inspection Service, to run our own meat program within the state. Now it's limiting to a degree, because what we agree to do is carry out the provisions of the Federal Meat Inspection Act on behalf of USDA. And in exchange, they reimburse us for 50% of the cost of that inspection. So it's a contractual agreement, but there's also deliverables that are expected on behalf of the department to send back to USDA to make sure that that federal act is being carried out. So when you enter into that kind of agreement, we as a State Department of Agriculture are saying we'll ensure that the provisions of the Federal Meat Inspection Act are carried out within the state of Wyoming. We get a lot of questions about that. What are the different ways of processing? How do we get meat out into commerce? So we put together this sheet here that says selling beef in Wyoming. This shows the exemptions and the flexibilities that are allowed for us. And so there's 3 types of processors today. Most of them in Wyoming, we have 29 that are custom exempt processors. And what this means is that you are exempt from some of the provisions of the Federal Meat Inspection Act. Not all of them, but you are exempt from day-to-day inspection as you're processing meat. So these are typically your smaller plants. And what custom exempt means, the name is a little bit misleading, but what the custom exemption allows for is you as a rancher to maintain ownership of an animal through the process. And you as a rancher can take your steer to a custom exempt processor, have it processed. And if you maintain custody of that product, it can come back to you, and you or non-paying members of your non-paying guests, say ranch hands, or your family, that beef stays with the owner. So this was an exemption that was created for producers primarily, that says this is meat that's not intended to enter into commerce. I'm sure most of you have had cattle processed under a custom exemption, and you'll notice you get the packages back and every one of them is marked not for sale. That's why you've maintained custody of that meat. So the liability also stays with you. That's the premise behind the custom exemption. Now, if you think back to last year, we had House Bill 168, and that was kind of an expansion of the Wyoming Food Freedom Act. There's been some interest of this group to have some discussion around the Food Freedom Act as well. And we can be fairly flexible until it comes to meat itself. And the Federal Meat Inspection Act is the reason why. But what House Bill 168 looked at was the eligibility for custom exempt processed beef to be able to be sold in commerce. And that was where we had a rub, where we didn't think we could maintain our equal to status with the Federal Meat Inspection Act, which is the bar we have to clear in order to maintain our primacy. So there's two ways that you can adhere to the provisions of the Federal Meat Inspection Act. One of them is to operate the same as them, which means you're using the same software. Your facilities are identical to what a federal plant would approve, and your inspectors carry a federal stamp that they put on the carcass. It's called a bug, but it essentially is a stamp that goes on that carcass that says USDA inspected. Once the carcass has that stamp on it, you know it's been inspected, and that meat can be sold internationally, or it can be sold interstate as well. The main limitation of state inspection is that anything that is processed under state processing can only be sold within the state of Wyoming. So even though USDA is paying for half of the expense of inspecting those carcasses, the reason they're doing that is to ensure that the Federal Meat Inspection Act is carried out within the state programs. So that's custom exemption. That's for ranchers. So previous versions of the Food Freedom Act allowed for animal shares. I think that came across in 2019, somewhere in that time frame. Talk about if you look in the current version of the Food Freedom Act, there's a provision in there where you can buy live animals. As many people as want to share in that animal can buy that live. It's still on the hoof. As long as they transfer ownership prior to slaughter, they would be eligible for custom exempt because they're owners of that livestock and that meat is coming directly back to them. Still not eligible for retail sale, but if you bought that meat beforehand, that's the limit of the Food Freedom Act today. House Bill 168 would have taken that a step further and said, we want custom exempt processed meat to be eligible for sale. And that's where we don't think we could achieve our equal to status and maintain our cooperative agreement with USDA and be able to maintain our program. If we can't maintain that equal to status, you go through a process called designation. My problem is USDA gets to decide whether or not you're equal to, or whether or not you're same as, and they do audits on us. And the Wyoming Department of Agriculture has been in increased scrutiny for the past several years after the passage of the animal shares portion of the Food Freedom Bill. USDA didn't like that. And so they told us they were going to do what they called targeted auditing of custom exempt processors in Wyoming. And so Justin and I sent out, state inspectors to the custom plants to let them know what was coming. And we said, here's what we think you might be asked. Here's the records we think you might be asked to produce. And I got a lot of calls during that time. Why are all these meat inspectors out blitzing the state and asking to see records? That was the reason why. They sent out a team of about a dozen, if I remember correctly, and they visited 18 different custom exempt plants over that time, and we had 0 findings. So USDA did not agree with us that animal shares did abide by the provisions of the Federal Meat Inspection Act. We've had that discussion back and forth. I still don't think that they fully agree, but they also can't find where we have exceeded the limits of the Federal Meat Inspection Act. So we had some letter writing campaigns back and forth to push back against that legislation. At this point, though, when we talk about provision or ideas like House Bill 168, let's just sell custom exempt processed beef over the internet or to our neighbors or in farmers markets. I think we would not be able to clear the equal to standard at that point and could risk the program. So every decision we make in the meat program basically stacks up against this one question, which is, can we maintain our equal to status and maintain our program? And everything that we that we go through with our meat plants is basically to adhere to that standard. So that's how we're operating that program today. I've basically gone over the state inspected processing plant as well. These require day-to-day inspection, and that meat can go into retail sale. It can go into grocery stores. It can go into restaurants. It can go into hotels. Anything within the state of Wyoming is open to state inspected meat. And then obviously federal inspection, that meat can go anywhere, but it's usually significantly more expensive. So I'll stop there and see if anybody has any questions about, what these exemptions mean. Custom exemptions, there's a retail exemption and a hotel exemption where if you're a processing plant in the state of Wyoming, and let's say you're state inspected, if you have a meat counter at the front of your butcher shop, you also are eligible for a retail exemption, which means that meat can go straight into retail sale without day-to-day inspection. That would be required under other federal the USDA inspected program or other state inspected products. Any questions on the meat program generally, or about, I'm particularly interested in House Bill 168. And if anybody has questions about that idea of trying to expand custom exempt processed meat for retail sale. Not in any real way. Typically, the way that we've gone about that has been, during what the appropriate legislative session, we've taken the bill and sent it to our partners at USDA and said, could you review this and essentially answer the question, can we maintain primacy of our program if this passes? And so those are the discussions that we've had up till this point in time. Exclusions, I'm not intimately familiar with. There is one program for that within the USDA inspection program, and it's called Cooperative Interstate Shipping. And we have explored that program before too. And essentially with that program, what USDA does is trains up your staff and they deputize them as USDA inspectors, but you still have to pay for them, and you still have to house them, and you have all of the incidental expenses that go along with that program. They give them a federal stamp that they put on carcasses. That allows interstate shipping of that carcass. But my thinking has always been, if you can get USDA to do their own inspections and pay 100% of the program instead of just a portion of it, why not do that? And so we have told our processors in the state of Wyoming that are looking to either upgrade their plant from state to federal or custom exempt to state, if there's any way that you can do it, you'll have a lot more flexibility if you go straight to federal inspection. Because with internet sales, we've really seen growth in wanting to sell meat across state lines. And that's not something we can provide as a state inspection entity. But that is the one exclusion, Eli, that we've looked at, in the past several years, is seeing if cooperative interstate shipping would be a fit for us. Today, I don't believe it is, but there's 7 states that participate in it. And I have talked with them, at great length about the pros and cons of that program. If we had a processor that was interested in pursuing that with us, recognizing it would be a big input of expense for them as well to get the plant up to the level it'd need to be, but we would enter into that agreement with them and pursue it if they wanted to.
Chair, just a quick question on the animal shares. How is that monitored or policed on whether there's 5 people that own a cow or 50 or 100? And how do you go about that process on determining that when it goes to processing? Thank you.
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The way we do that now is there's 2 different vehicles to prove ownership. One of them would be through a traditional brand inspection form. You get a brand certificate upon change of ownership, and it may list out a number of different people. That's one way, but for us as a Department of Agriculture, if you have a bill of sale even that was generated, that you kept with the records of that animal, we would also accept that as proof of ownership for the purposes of direct to slaughter. And so that's listed out in statute as well. It's either brand inspection form or a bill of sale that you would create just a permanent record that says I bought this live, makes you eligible for that program. Now, I would just have to say, out of our experience, that's not been done by processors because they don't want to wait for 50 people to pick up meat, and they only have so much cold storage. So it's not that workable of a program. I would encourage anybody that wants to, if you want to sell meat, there's a pathway for you, particularly now. I mean, we are processing significantly more meat in the state of Wyoming than we ever have in the past. And there's been exponential growth in the past 5 years. We've never seen anything like it. So I think there is potential to be able to do business and increase business for freezer beef for a lot of our ranchers that like to do that kind of thing. Well, there's a lot more opportunity today than there has been in the past. And I'm not sure animal shares is something that is worth the paperwork and the struggle when you could use one of these other outlets and get that done.
Mr. Director, I'm sorry, Bobby, you said, you said 12 processors, and are there any processors that have gone through that federal process to do interstate sales? How many? How are they doing from what you've been hearing?
Yes, Mr. Co-Chairman, I think we've got an example here in the room. Kelly Lockhart back there, he years ago was state inspected and is federally inspected today. And so we've had some other examples of that in the state. You know, this plant over in Hudson is a recent example as a part of the meat processing expansion grant program that we did 2 years ago. They went from state inspection to federal inspection just to open the audience up a little bit more and increase our customer base.
So Doug, sorry to defend. Keep regular figures on that.
We do. So, in fact, I have a comparison here. This is something that we testified to Joint Ag earlier in the year. So if you take a look pre-pandemic for the amount that we processed in 2020, right pre-pandemic, total head slaughtered 7,100, 5.9 million pounds. And then in 2022, so for last year, total head slaughtered 12,700, total pounds processed 10.2. So we went from 7,100 to 12,700, and we went from 5.9 million to 10.2 million. Just in that time frame. But we had a real gold rush mentality around meat processing during that time too. We were processing a lot of applications.
Doug, how much are we had some various meat products over to Taiwan or any other places. Is that still?
Mr. Chairman, we're still doing that to a small level. You know, we've got shipments here and there that go, but we're unable to fill shipping containers. And so it's kind of niche markets that there's still a smattering of beef that's going over there, but we haven't been able to develop that market to, I think, any of our satisfaction to this point in time. Pandemic really messed things up in terms of both on the import and export side of meat in particular. It's just recovering now, actually.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Director Miyamoto. Your comments about the grant program, which was successful on so many levels, and I'm personally aware of many of the members in my organization that were able to take advantage of that opportunity. I just throw that out there for your consideration as we're looking at ways to open that window up. And the example that you gave us here is how Hudson was able to reach a larger audience. Could that possibly be another vehicle to solve the dilemma that we're trying to get at here by helping people reach broader audiences, by maybe contemplating funding that grant program again, as opposed to trying to look at statutory changes? That seemed like it was a successful vehicle to try to reach that end goal, to help people get from one category into the next. And so perhaps that might be the easiest road of travel to open up, if it were the purview of the legislature, to support that policy of getting people in the next category, to entertain funding and reopening that grant process open again for people that are interested in reaching that wider audience. Your thoughts on that?
Mr. Chairman, Cindy, thanks for the question. I think, we've contemplated that. You have to recognize that was one shot funding. Those were ARPA funds that fed into that program initially. Those were pandemic relief program funds that we did have some impact on the meat sector in particular. And so that money was appropriately funneled that way. I think it would be smart. This is just my opinion. But in looking at the way this is all going, I think it would be good to let the market stabilize a little bit and see what the realities of the quantities that we can responsibly process might be and the demand for that beef. Now that we're on the other side of the pandemic, we have a lot more processing capacity today than we did going into the pandemic. We've got a lot more people doing that. I would like to see what the market demand ultimately levels out to be. There may be a demand for additional processing beyond what we're doing today. And in that way, I would say that the Department of Ag has experience running these programs now. The way we did it was upfront costs of the processors. We did it on a reimbursable basis. And so they had to, and it was done on a cost share basis. It was done on a 50-50 match. And that gave them a significant discount, but they also had buy-in in that project. And looking back on it, I think that was the right way to do that. I'm glad we did it the way that we did. But we know we have the capacity to manage that type of grant program. We just want to make sure we do it right and that we don't put people in peril by promising a market that might not exist for them. So I would say I would like to watch it for a little while and see how everything levels out.
And how have all those funds been expended and how much grant dollars were available?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. So initially the governor had liquidated a total of $10 million, but the turnaround times were fast. The most limiting factor of this grant program was how fast we had to have applications back and how fast we had to have receipts turned back into us in order to liquidate the money and pay the reimbursements. And those were deadlines that were intrinsic in the ARPA funds. And so our turnaround times were really fast. We were notified of a program, we had to promulgate rules, and I think we were done with that in 2 weeks. And the entire program was slated to end within start to finish something like 90 days. We started in the fall of that year and everything had to have been expended by December 30th. So we even had to have all the receipts back, and people had trouble getting the parts that they had ordered. If you wanted to hang another rail and you had to order that, we had trouble getting that stuff installed with receipts to reimburse by December 30th. But that was our big cutoff. So we ended up with, memory serves me correctly, between $7 and $8 million of total reimbursements out of that chunk. So we got most of it out the door, but our limiting factor was how fast the turnaround times had to be.
Okay, further questions for Doug? Go ahead.
Director, what I'm listening to is you've outlined why we can't expand this. Okay, maybe let's think outside of the box while you're evaluating what has gone on through this growth period. Let's come up with a plan that we can. What are the directions we need to do this? you know, there's apparently an appetite in the public for this to occur. So let's not look at why we can't, but what are the steps we need to do to go forward? Does that make sense?
It makes sense to me on a common sense level, yes. I mean, you know, that begs the obvious question, help us out. Show us what we can do. Where are the limits? Unfortunately, I think my answer has to be, we found that edge with animal shares. USDA did not like that. They wrote us a letter and said, we do not think you're adhering to your equal to standard. We don't think so because that was not the intent of the custom exemption. And so we wrote a letter back that said, we disagree. We think that as long as that transfer of ownership takes place prior to slaughter, we think that they are owners of that animal. And we sent that back and said, how, you know, what can we do with this? And they don't like that. So I would like to be able to tell you that I have some grandiose idea, because I do recognize that there's a demand for that in the public. And then, you know, I'm putting my inspectors in a particularly difficult position. And some of this is my fault, because I've told them, under no circumstances are we to lose primacy for our state meat inspection program. That's not an option for us. We've got 29 custom exempt processors that depend on us maintaining this program. We've got another dozen or so state inspected facilities that are depending on us to maintain our primacy. So failing an audit is not an option for us. But on the same side of the coin, if I have inspectors that go in for a plan review and they're going to open a new plant, I'll get calls that say, your inspectors are inflexible and they're telling us we need to have rail heights that are X and the distance being Y, and we're having trouble. And I think a lot of that is because I'm telling our inspectors, I don't want to lose our primacy. You have to adhere to that equal to standard. I don't want findings on our audit, but I do want you to be approachable, and I want you to serve in a technical assistance capacity and help people figure out how they can comply with the Federal Meat Inspection Act. So I've got them pinched, and I want them to be nice, but then I also want them to maintain our primacy, which I think is the boil down point for a lot of the contention that exists. And it's not just Wyoming. I've heard that about almost all of my counterparts nationwide too. And we have had states that have expanded their programs to include animal shares. But I do think that's the limit of the Federal Meat Inspection Act, to be honest. That's where I think the edge is.
Mr. Co-Chair, if I might. A little bit out of order, but since we're on this subject, Mr. Lockhart, would you mind coming up here for a minute? I got a question for you. Don't be afraid, Kelly. It's okay. And while you're sitting down, Doug, one question for you. You said that we were targeted when we did the animal shares program, and inspectors came in and we're you know, amping up the inspections. You talked to folks beforehand and there was no real problem. Has it abated at all? Are they still coming at the same level? Is it kind of backed off a bit? Or ask Kelly here.
Mr. Chairman, we were lucky after that animal shares bill passed. I know that there were some additional states that followed suit. And I think that they, you know, generally speaking, I know that this happened in Minnesota and some other states that they have higher processing totals than we do. I still think that when USDA comes out and does our audits, particularly within our custom exempt program, they're going to want to see proof of ownership prior to slaughter. And if they don't find that, that's going to be a real problem for us. So they're aware of that, but they're also watching, you know, how we're running our program very carefully, but we're not getting letters anymore.
With your, so I'm saying, and in total transparency for the committee, actually, I'm going to ask Mr. Lockhart a question, but I also just want to let everybody know I actually buy beef from Mr. Lockhart in my business and I serve it and I'm proud to do it. He does a great job for me. Then so, but I just wanted to know I wasn't going to ask any leading questions. one of my purveyors, but Mr. Lockhart, the director is saying that you're one of the processes that has gone through the process. My question to you, how did it work for you? How is it going now? And then your takeaways, what do you think, maybe suggestions for this committee on things that we could do, if anything, and just your general take?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kelly Lockhart, Lockhart Cattle Company. So we were, I don't want to say one of the first to kind of enter the craft beef business. My sons came back from college and they said, "Dad, you're doing it the old fashioned way, and the world is changing, and people really want to know where their food comes from. They want to know how their animals are handled. They want to know what's going on in the local community and how that integrates." And so we started out having it processed by a plant that was state inspected. We didn't have anything to do with it. And there were some growing pains with not controlling that part of the supply chain. Just to give you a little background, that for some of you that don't know, we're a ranch, but we're really a vertically integrated food company. We control the animal from when it hits the ground to when it hits the plate, as Chairman Grew mentioned. And so when you control the supply chain, you know, there are some hiccups along the way, whether that's delivery, whether that's employees. And the one that was quite honestly the most difficult to solve was the processing facility. And so this was kind of before, as Director Miyamoto mentioned, there was a lot of experience in doing that, quite honestly. And you know, so ultimately we ended up buying the facility, working with the state, and our inspectors were located in Cokeville. You know, Jackson's not an easy place to have employees, state employees or any employees, right? So to Mr. Miyamoto's credit and the department's credit, that's what they could do. But, you know, we needed inspectors that were closer because, you know, when you're processing this meat, you really do have to have, and we want to have inspectors on site. And that's part of the food safety issue, right? We want that. So as we grew and the business took off, so to speak, we're very fortunate in Teton County that people want to support local producers. We did transition that plant from state inspected to federal inspected. And that was relatively, I don't want to say easy for us, but one of the things that was easy was that there were other people in the area that were doing value added meat, and they weren't necessarily doing full processing, but they needed federal inspection to stuff the sausages and stuff the stack sticks. And so they needed those inspectors. So there were other businesses in town that needed a USDA inspector. So that transition worked fairly well. And to the point that, you know, we have a federal inspector that's really in the vicinity. Sometimes they don't live in Teton County. Sometimes, you know, there are some people that come in and out, but that transition, quite honestly, worked fairly well and is functioning quite well. In terms of what the state does, since we don't really deal with the state inspection system, I don't think I'm qualified to really comment on that, but happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That's my further question would be is, you said the process was not that, you know, was not easy, but not that difficult to make the switch over. And it's worked for you and worked for your business and your company. do you feel that it has, and I know you've been on board, state boards and, you know, livestock boards around the state and worked with a lot of other ranchers in the state. Do you feel this has applicability statewide more, that we have more capacity that we can grow this? Or do you think we're, you know, things that we could do to get there? Or are we about at our comfortable carrying capacity now? How do you see this evolving, I guess, would be my question.
Well, again, Director Miyamoto would be better qualified to answer that than I. The capacity has increased substantially, as he mentioned. And there is, you know, there is a limit to how much demand you can have. Most of our stuff, most of our meat is sold locally to restaurants like Chairman Garuz. And we also distribute through the grocery stores, and we also are direct to consumer. So we have a three-pronged distribution that is primarily all local. We do a little bit of internet sales, but everyone's doing that. So when you get into the interstate transport of beef or food in general, this is not necessarily a fledgling industry anymore. I mean, you can go online and buy anything and get anything, and you know, it'll be on your doorstep relatively quickly. So it's a growing industry. People do want to you know where their food comes from, but the internet has changed that over the last, well, since we started in the business, when that really wasn't being done, or not very much of it anyway. And quite honestly, you know, it's a lot easier to ship that stuff, you know, put it in a cooler and ship it, as opposed to the local. So I can't really speak to it, but it's a little different business than it was when everybody wanted to get in it 5 years ago. So I don't know what that looks like. We're a little bit isolated from that because of what we do and how we do it. But they're like all good things, there is a limit.
Thanks, Kelly. I have a question for you that has to pertain to another proposal that we had talked about as part of the task force, which was, I think, a place where we as a Department of Ag are lacking is in our ability to spend our time helping processors make a transition, either, you know, going from nothing into a custom exempt processing plant, a custom exempt plant to a state plant to a federal plant. Trying to provide that technical assistance is tough from an inspection standpoint. We have folks that are coming from Cokeville to do daily inspections when Lockhart Meats was a state inspected facility, and that was their day, but they couldn't go into plants that are just trying to come online and help them navigate this maze of federal regulations that really is difficult. Did you have enough technical assistance to get your questions answered when you made that transition from state inspection to federal inspection? And could the process, is there something we could have done to help better?
So I wasn't involved in the day-to-day, you know, my sons, and we had we have a meat manager. So I have to say that I try not to be involved in that daily activity, and quite honestly, they don't want me involved in that daily activity. But there were some growing pains with that, and any technical expertise when it has to do with food safety and the transition would be helpful, because, you know, we're, in a lot of cases, we are, that's not our field of expertise. We were fortunate that we had a meat manager that was educated at the University of Wyoming and came through that program. And actually Kelsey was his professor at the time. And so there was some pretty good education that came out of the University of Wyoming that helped. And, you know, I'm sure that he or they did reach out to you for that expertise and that navigation. It was not simple, but it was doable. And so to the extent that these custom processors want to go to the next level, that surely could be, you surely could help them navigating that. Because in most cases, that's, the paperwork of going through that food safety issue is, or process is not as simple as it could be.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Lockhart. Your testimony has been incredibly helpful. For me, what I keep coming back to as I listen to this discussion is, what is the goal? Agriculture is our number 3 economic driver in Wyoming. And agriculture also is a vehicle for us to keep Wyoming kids in Wyoming and on the ranch. So as much as I appreciate, the excellent work that Mr. Miyamoto has done here by designing some of these handouts to really simplify, because these are incredibly instructive to me, that I think I'm pretty on top of stuff. And I had a big fat question mark in my head. Now these diagrams really help me kind of solidify what box do I need to be in for what purpose. But if the goal is to help processors get to that next level, then I think we need to be looking to, our leaders, our policymakers in the state to get the right resources. Because as Mr. Miyamoto identified, if the goal is just keep the program, make sure we don't have any violations, don't lose our primacy, then we keep doing what we're doing. If our goal is helping the producers get to the next level, helping expand internet sales, which to me sounds like there's a potential for enormous growth there, knowing that the overhead, you don't have a storefront, you know what I mean? Like it's a different business model to be shipping over the internet with the world being Wyoming's customer. So if that is the goal, to try to help grow the market in that way. And I certainly understand Mr. Miyamoto's comment about we don't want to oversaturate what we've worked so hard to build with our people on the ground here in Wyoming, and that we need a little bit of time to assess what we need to do there. But what I hear from Mr. Lockhart is that, we have unlimited potential if we were able to grow in this internet space, to increase our production, to be able to tap into that market. So I just really challenge this task force and the department, as well as our elected leaders, to kind of figure out, what is that goal? For me, the goal that I'm sitting here today that I'd like to offer and contribute is, how do we help grow this market and help our number 3 industry continue to grow and expand? And as I mentioned, provide those Wyoming jobs for our Wyoming kids and to keep Wyoming kids on Wyoming ranches. So, maybe there's some things that we could be looking at as an ag subcommittee to get us out of just maintaining the status quo of making sure we have no violations that would jeopardize our primacy, into getting some systems and processes put in place to offer that technical assistance to get from one category to the next, with the goal of maybe increasing internet sales or, reaching that wider audience should the market support. So I encourage this discussion, and I'm very thankful to hear that we'll be going on additional time, that we'll have time over the next year, hopefully, or biennium, to be able to look at these issues in greater detail. So with that, what is the goal?
Chairman, Mr. Lockhart, I had a question generally about people with noncompliance with, say, inspections. Is there in fact a black market out there for people just shipping beef wherever they want to without following these rules? That's an open-ended question. I just wonder if it's 100% compliance or not, and what you knew about it.
I'm not aware of any non-compliance in our area. I'm not saying that it doesn't exist, but I'm actually not aware of that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Follow up on the issue with USDA inspections. You indicated that it wasn't all that difficult to shift to a USDA inspection from, say, a state inspections situation. Frankly, I don't know how else to grow a market unless we utilize USDA inspectors. I just wanted to hear your thoughts about how do we expand the market when when we've heard that it's very difficult for us to go beyond our state ability. So how difficult is it to do that with the USDA inspection program?
Well, I don't want to give you the wrong impression that it was easy. but it was doable. I mean, I don't want to under, don't want to overpromise, so to speak, but maybe, as I mentioned, our meat manager had expertise that this farm boy from Pavilion didn't have. And so he was able to navigate that. And again, I mentioned on a daily basis, he was able to deal with the inspectors and speak the language and, go through the paperwork. And again, maybe that was with help from his professor at the University of Wyoming, who, again, understood that process. So what I would say is if the state wants to support, that move to the next level, then I think there could be resources that could be dedicated to that through the Department of Ag, as Director Miyamoto mentioned, to help navigate that system. Because as Mr. Delancey mentioned, the world is your market with the internet sales these days, and that has to be USDA. I can't see, and maybe Mr. Miyamoto would help me here, but I can't see the state navigating the interstate sale of meat. That is USDA, and that is their purview. And so to the extent that people want to get to that next level, then as you mentioned, they are going to have to go to USDA, and it can be done. It can be done. And we're proof of it. And as Director Miyamoto mentioned, there are others. I think you mentioned, 10 or 12 that are or have done that. So it can be done. I don't know if I answered your question, but.
Chairman, the suggestion I might make, and I know it's outside a little bit of this committee's purview, but as we get more USDA inspected facilities in the state, I think that it would be helpful to have some mechanism similar to what we do with a lot of the federal land stuff. When it comes time to talk to USDA, I think the state can weigh in and say, okay, guys, you're doing things wrong or whatever. USDA has traditionally been a little bit of a hidebound entity when it comes to meat inspection. And if we're wanting to make an impact on the federal level, where I think our producers are kind of headed, I think we should, as a state, look at an effort to try and say, okay, how can we reach out to those folks that are USDA inspected, get their feedback on where can we as a state provide some comments at a national level that says, hey, USDA, you should look at this. I think right now in Congress, there does seem to be some appetite to try and move USDA away from the traditional mechanism that they've always operated under to something that would be a little more amenable to these smaller producers, trying to make those folks work. And so that's just a suggestion I would have, is that whether it's through this committee or some mechanism, that we try to stay abreast of what's going on with USDA inspected facilities and try to help them as a state work on things.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, I do have a response for that. For the past, I think 4 Congresses, maybe 3, I'm trying to remember, interstate sale of state inspected meat. 4. Okay. We have helped our congressional delegation craft 4 bills over the past 4 Congresses to try to open up the Federal Meat Inspection Act and allow interstate sale of state inspected meat. I was telling you before, if we're state inspected, you're limited to the boundaries of the state of Wyoming. That's not done for health and safety reasons. We have the same inspection parameters and standards as do USDA when we go in there and look at things like sanitation and humane handling. What we've been told is the reason there's separation between USDA and state inspection for export purposes is for free trade agreement requirements and traceability. And those have been the primary reasons that we've been told that's why we can't allow interstate sale of state inspected products. But we do maintain traceability, and all of our facilities have a number that are assigned to them. So I don't think that that's a problem. And we've tried to help through the past 4 Congresses get eligibility for state inspected product across state lines. And I think that that's a potential for us to be able to open up some of that flexibility. And then back to this idea about, an outreach and education liaison for federal meat regulations. That was an idea put forward just because I don't think we're meeting the need in helping people establish new plants or to transition into new ones. And maybe inspectors aren't the right place for that kind of messaging. But I do think it could fit into this idea of a regulatory sandbox. We might be able to identify this as one of the needs that we could put into that space where that office of regulatory compliance, or whatever it's called, could offer that technical assistance to help bring people along and tell them, what they need to do in order to do what Mr. Lockhart's been able to do.
Chairman Grew and Chairman Nicholas, I might mention that when I was on the business council, the business council did do an analysis. This was some years ago about what maybe could be done at the state level to help processing facilities. And I don't remember everything in that study, but the business council does have an ag person. And one of the examples, for example, that all plants were facing, whether it was state, custom exempt, or USDA, was offal, the disposition of the offal, right? And most of those, most of the plants, as we still are, we just take that to the local sanitation facility. I mean, is there an opportunity to use that? Is there an opportunity to market that? Is there an opportunity to do something with that would be helpful for all the plants, that would also make the plants more efficient, as well as not burden the landfills and the sanitation facilities, or those plants that are hooked up to a community sanitation facility. So that's just an example of something that the state could do to help the local processing facilities, no matter what inspection. That's just one example. There was a laundry list of things that we looked at the business council, and I think you'll have Mr. Durrell here tomorrow. I'm not sure, a little different subject, but I just mentioned that because this is something that has been looked at and should be continued to be looked at, quite honestly.
Director, you always say that in order for the state to protect its primacy, we're just a little bit higher standard. Is that right? So there's nothing in question with the USDA isn't that what I'm hearing from you? That our inspection just a little bit higher than what the minimum standards are. So there's that gray area doesn't exist, so that we are a little bit better.
Well, we've been through a lot of these audits, so we kind of know what the expectations are going to be in order to survive our audit process.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't know as though we get so specific to say, if USDA is requiring a rail height of 18 feet, we want it 18 feet, 6 inches. I don't think we get that specific, but there are instances, there's a lot of times when a plant owner may have a unique situation that doesn't fit the USDA guidelines very well. And what we'll do is we'll document how they can achieve the same health and safety standards as could be achieved through the guidelines. And if we can common sense defend it, then we'll send it in that way and we'll defend it. And if an infield audit comes out and takes a look at that process that may not achieve the same standard as the guideline, we'll tell them why. And we'll say, we think we can still achieve separation, or whatever it is we're looking at. We kind of take those on a case by case basis but we don't have a process that says, we're going to take a look at all of USDA's standards and put additionality into our review. We don't do that.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So then, if I'm hearing you correctly, so if we want to have the state's standards, state inspected beef, slaughter plants, if they're just a little bit better than the USDA, then we take a stamp that says this carcass is Wyoming approved. Would there be a marketing tool in there that says, oh yeah, that's USDA, but this is Wyoming carcass beef, just a little bit better? Does that give us a tool to market that beef?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, yes. And we have a Wyoming inspected stamp that goes on every carcass that we take a look at. And there's also Wyoming specific marketing campaigns that are used for beef today.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director Miyamoto. Is there an issue about having two stamps on a carcass, a USDA stamp and a Wyoming stamp?
Shouldn't happen. If it's on one path or the other.
Just to follow up with that, if we're trying to market our beef to say our beef is superior to USDA beef, then wouldn't it be advantageous to have two stamps on said carcass? I mean, is there a law prohibiting those two stamps? I suppose is my question.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, the jurisdiction either falls under your USDA or to the state, one or the other. And I think sometimes that mark of inspection gets confused with beef grading, where you have this system of prime, choice, select, all of those types of beef quality grades those are additional. So you'll have a stamp on there that says this carcass was inspected for human health and safety. It's either eligible under USDA inspection or state inspection. So it's got that stamp on it. But then a lot of plants hire beef graders as well as part of USDA ag marketing service. And then they can grade out those cuts as, prime, choice, select. And that's the marketing for beef quality that goes forward. There also is no limitation if a Wyoming producer wants to market their cattle under a Wyoming name, they can do that, and that has value. So we would approve the label, but we do have several instances of Wyoming branded beef within the state.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Doug, the question I have, we're sitting here talking about the world market, and of course, you and I think Mr. Chairman, we've made several trips to Taiwan. How does this all relate to try to market our beef out of Wyoming, like to a place like Taiwan or the Pacific Rim to into Japan? Is there a way under the regulatory form that we could, is this helping it? Is there stumbling blocks there that we maybe could do? I know that's a market we're trying to cultivate, and I'm not sure the extent of it and how well it's doing, but seems to me that there's really a place there for Wyoming beef.
Mr. Chairman, I would agree. There is a place, there's a lot of demand. They want the story that goes along with the beef. And so we've gone over there, and asked restaurateurs and people that run hotels in those countries what it is they're looking for. And a lot of times in those international markets, they look at the United States agricultural system as being one that's very industrialized. And so any move that you can make away from that tail and essentially, sell the custom and culture of the state of Wyoming, because Wyoming is not viewed as industrial at all. And so that's the marketing piece that has value in other countries to me, because when people think of our state, they think of wide open vistas and historic ranches and kind of this cowboy culture. That is not what they think of when they just see US beef. So I do think that there's a market for that, and the way we've been able to get into those niche markets is through that story that we can tell behind that product. On the regulatory side, the limitation that you have is that most of your ag trade agreements, so if you have something like USMCA, where you have the US, Canada, Mexico agreement for ag trade, most of those are predicated on one federal system of inspection. And so they're going to demand that those be USDA inspected, just as we would demand that their equivalent counterparts in Canada and Mexico ensure that the wholesomeness of that product coming across the border is the same as ours to maintain that level playing field. So in these previous congressional efforts that I've talked about, where we've helped with bills to allow interstate sale of state inspected meat products, we've never pushed for international sale. And the reason is because most of those trade agreements are predicated on one reliable system of inspection.
Just want to make one comment. There was discussion, we received ARPA, CARES Act money used for grant programs and some comments made about trying to monetarily incentivize these processors potentially. I don't think that's a road we should go down. It distorts the market. I mean, I don't know, the CARES Act money, we're just adding to the national debt. You know, if these processors can't stand on their own without taxpayer funds, it's not a good business model to begin with. So just a comment there that I think that we ought to steer away from any monetary incentives on this discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just an open-ended question to Director Miyamoto, most likely. Have we had any producers fail in the state of Wyoming where they went out of business because say there's too many of them, let's just say, and I don't know if we're reached market saturation or not, but I think you indicated that we may be coming close to that. So the question I have is, has anyone gone out of business and that was involved with the slaughter business in the state of Wyoming? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, not as a result of the grant program, at least not yet. We haven't seen any of the businesses that were successful in applying for grants go out of business yet. We've certainly seen players come and go over the years for various number of reasons, but I've been watching closely the impact that our program has had on the sector in general. We haven't seen anybody go out of business yet, because I think everybody here heard the stories that in order to get slaughter dates, you were years out and you just had a backlog of people. And I think we're still dealing with a glut. But I do think the severity of that's decreased over the past several months, and the trend continues to be that it will reduce. My ongoing concern has always been, as you grow this sector, you also have to grow your ability to inspect. And Mr. Lockhart brought up a good point. I mean, we have a limited number of inspectors and none of them were in the Jackson area. And so in order to get that all covered, not just for the state of Wyoming inspectors, but USDA is going to have to come up with additional inspection capacity in order to meet this new demand of drastically increased processing. And that's one of the things that I would like to draw attention of this task force and for my home committee of joint agriculture to keep an eye on. We have to be able to supply that service, otherwise they can't legally process meat.
I think we're ready for Director Parvit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So regarding this particular subject matter, I've got two things to cover. The first one will be on meat processing plants, continuation of this discussion, but related to disposal of animal mortality waste. And then the other one that I would like to cover would be related to the comment that came in recently to the task group on beaver dam analogs. So I'll touch briefly on both of those and then open it up for questions. So on the meat processing plants and disposal of animal mortality waste, this has been a discussion of the Joint Ag Committee throughout the interim. And what we recognize is that there are more plants, as Director Miyamoto has said, that there are more plants today than there were just a few years ago. And the issue is trying to identify an economic method for disposal of the animal mortality waste as we move forward. We've identified several options through our guideline, but not necessarily all of them are economic for the industry. But they do have several options. One of those options is to go to the landfills, but it's up to the landfill on whether or not they will accept animal waste. That's not something that is dictated by the DEQ, but we would be notified if a local landfill were to choose to do that, to accept that. One of the issues that we talked about a couple of years ago was that as we moved to the cease and transfer program on landfills, where communities can decide that it's not cost effective to maintain a landfill in a small community because they can't sustain the long-term closure costs. So they would have the option to come to the DEQ and to the State Loan and Investment Board for a grant or a loan to close the small landfill and go to a transfer facility. But what that's done is that removes some of the options that would be available, that had been available to these meat processing facilities for disposal of their animal mortality waste. So we've started conversations over the last year. We've had conversations with the Association of Meat Processors to try to find solutions to this issue. I'm not convinced that we need necessarily legislation. However, probably some rulemaking would be in order that would allow something similar to what South Dakota has, where we have certain criteria that would be spelled out in terms of how big of the area is, what the underground soil type is, proximity to wells, to surface waters and that kind of thing. And then develop a notification process where a meat processing facility could on their facility dispose of this animal mortality waste that meets this criteria. It would just be a notification and a certification that they meet those setback criteria. So that's, I think, where we're headed as a potential solution. We're having continued conversations with the chairs of the Joint Ag Committee to try to come up with an acceptable solution here that meets the economic needs of the industry, but also protects the groundwater and surface water resources. So that's the first one. I'll stop there. See if there's
Questions for Todd on that topic? Go ahead, Todd.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Director. So you're saying that you believe wholly through rule changes that you can say conform to South Dakota's method of handling waste on site, and you don't think there's any need to date to have a statutory change?
So, Mr. Chairman, that would be my take on it right now, is that we would just need to make the demonstration that the process that we set up meets the criteria for an alternative design, which is allowed by EPA in the rules.
Follow up on that. So I also sit on ag. I think the issue that is really being talked about is the EPA has not challenged South Dakota. And as such, it has been no challenge. So I don't see why we have an issue or restriction. I mean, I don't know, we have to research something that hasn't been challenged already by another state. We've heard about the USDA and how they come down on Wyoming on compliance. And if South Dakota's done it, I just don't, I don't foresee why that's an issue to work with the federal government when they haven't challenged it. So I just talk generally to the committee is I think this is one avenue. The best avenue we have is decrease costs for producers in the state of Wyoming, and that's the low hanging fruit. And I think this certainly seems like goes a long way to fix that. You know, making this cost less for producers. Thank
So
you.
Todd, maybe you could explain to us what South Dakota has done.
Well, Mr. Chairman, so South Dakota actually has a program where they have setback requirements. So many feet from residences, from drinking water wells, surface waters and the like. I'm not real clear on soil types, but I'm sure they take a look at the soil types that the disposal would be occurring in. And then they just do, it's kind of like a permit by rule. Although I don't know if they have that in their rule package or if that's just a policy that they have, that's how they're going to manage that. That's what we would take a look at is, you know, I mean, if we go through a rulemaking process, which I think we have the ability to do without necessarily having any additional statutory provisions, that we would just look at what's the appropriate setback distances. We have a good starting point as to what South Dakota has. We would just want to make sure that that fits correctly for Wyoming.
Okay, further questions on that? Okay, any further questions for Todd on this topic? If not, go ahead, Todd.
All right, so the next topic is beaver dam analogs, and this is something that came in to the task force as something that was requested to take a look at. So I'll just kind of describe what the issue is, what beaver dam analogs are, and then a potential solution moving forward. So first off, these beaver dam analogs, I'll call them BDAs, are for restoring wetlands and balancing stream flows from major runoff. And they're basically to simulate the functionality of a beaver dam. So they're not impoundments. What they are is a low cost, low tech option for managing those types of surface waters. The issue that was brought out in the correspondence that we received was that the process is cumbersome and costly to get the approval for the BDA. And why that is that because these BDAs are installed in waters of the US potentially, they require a 404 permit from the Army Corps of Engineers. And when there's a 404 permit that's issued by the Corps, the state has to issue a what's called a 401 certification under the Clean Water Act to ensure that the water quality standards are going to be protected by that activity that's occurring in a water of the United States. Now, as all of you are probably aware, there's a lot of discussion over what is a water of the United States. And that discussion continues at the federal level as well. So if you're doing, if you can identify what whether or not it's a water of the United States, if it's not a water of the United States, a 404 certification or a permit from the Corps is not required. But for this instance, what we're talking about is that where it is a WOTUS, 404 permit is required. And there are two types of 401 certification that the state can provide. One is a categorical certification, which means it's an activity that is just automatically approved by the state. And that's the smaller, lower risk type projects. And then there's an individual certification for the larger type projects that have a higher risk of impacting water quality standards. So currently, there's a decision was made about 15 years ago with some conversations between the DEQ, the Corps of Engineers, and the Game and Fish, Wyoming Game and Fish, as to what would be the demarcation zone between a low risk and a high risk on these particular type of structures, these BDAs. And it was determined that a 500 linear foot demarcation would be the appropriate break point. And so if a BDA project is 500 linear feet or less, then it is an automatic categorical certification. If it's greater than 500 linear feet, then it would require an individual certification. So that's the current landscape. What we think there's an opportunity here is to get reconvene the Game and Fish, the Corps of Engineers, probably Department of Agriculture as well, and have the discussion about okay, how has that worked over the last 15 years? Do we need to make an adjustment? So if we have individual certifications, have we seen any issues with those? And then maybe we can make an adjustment to where that breakpoint is. So that's kind of what I would suggest moving forward with that particular issue. The other concern was the length of time that it takes for getting the 404 permit and the certification. There's an additional 60 days now as a result of some rule changes that EPA made to the 401 certification process. And I think this is what they're referring to in the letter. And the additional 60 days comes from the rule for 401 certifications is that the applicant has to submit a pre-filing meeting request 30 days before submitting the application. And that's by federal rule. Our position would be there are some benefit on certain projects to do that, but the state should have the ability to waive that requirement if appropriate. That doesn't exist right now. So you have that 30-day pre-application notification process. And the other 30-day component here is that EPA has 30 days once we submit our 401 certification to the Corps of Engineers. The Corps submits the 404 permit and the 401 certification to EPA so that they can do their analysis to ensure that the project will not interfere or affect the water quality standards of a neighboring state or tribe. Now they have 30 days to do that, and more often than not, the clock runs out on EPA, and so it's just after 30 days and they can move forward with the project. But it's questionable the value of that 30 days if nobody's taking an action on that. But that's why the extra time associated with these projects and understandable frustration. So with that, that's a quick summary of the letter from the on the BDAs.
Mr. Chairman, Director, so that means here in Wyoming, we've lost a whole construction season just through the process to get to the constructed. Is that what you're saying?
So, Mr. Chairman, yes, in some cases, it just depends on when the application is made for the project. But yes, there is a smaller window to do these projects than in other states. And so that can be problematic, and you could, depending on the timing, lose one season or 1 year in order to implement that project.
Mr. Chairman.
Go ahead.
What I have, Todd, is, you know, there was a Supreme Court decision, maybe it's been 10 to 12 years ago, about navigable streams, and it was really widely interpreted in a way that I didn't like. But now we have another Supreme Court decision talks about navigable waters, and where you put these BDAs are not navigable. So why do we even need to go through this permitting process? We can just say it's ephemeral or it's not navigable, and we can do what we want to do ourselves within Wyoming without going through the process with the permits and the Corps.
So, yeah, so the definition of waters of the United States is a challenge. There was a recent Supreme Court decision that came out here earlier this year that changed the landscape a little bit. Wyoming is one of a number of states that has joined with North Dakota in a lawsuit, and Wyoming, it currently is operating with a definition of waters of the United States that is pre-2015. So
So we need to change that.
so there are continuing discussions going on there. EPA was coming out, and I haven't looked to see the details there, but the EPA is coming out with a post-Sackett version of a definition of waters in the United States. So that's something that we all need to keep an eye on and see where they came out in that. But the litigation continues.
So is this a topic that ag has taken up? Do we know, John or anybody? It's.
Mr. Mr. Director, help me out here. On these 500 feet or less permits, how many people have come in and applied, or maybe more to the point, how many people have come in and applied and heard about the process and then run out the door?
So Mr. I don't have a number of
How to feel for it?
that, but there's been a fair number, but I don't have a number that I can share with you.
Fine, okay.
So, and just to follow up on that, curious what the need is, what the demand is, I mean, we've got Jim's letter, but I spent 20 years of my life getting rid of beavers, as opposed to bringing them back. And it sounds to me like it might be cheaper to bring the beavers back, but so I'm just curious how prevalent the need is or the demand, and both here and elsewhere.
What I can say is that there's interest, and I think as you know, the Stock Growers has raised the issue that there's sufficient interest that the interest is because it's a low cost option for managing the water in their particular instance. But the extent of the problem, I don't have a feel for that. And perhaps Mr. McGagnon can provide some input on that.
Yeah, I think just to the committee, I think we ought to follow up on this and particularly on the concept of, on the definition that we're currently working on. And if ag is not doing it, we have a fairly short window to get that accomplished and get a bill drafted that would tailor towards the recent Supreme Court decision. And so I think as a follow-up to this meeting, Hank, that's something that you might want to bring back to the chair so we don't follow up other actions that are similarly taking place around other states where we can piggyback on their work, but get something done. That's something that we don't want to lag behind.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that's so important because there's a big difference between, you know, what was going on prior to 2015 and where we are today with the recent decision. And I know that EPA is trying to now draft rules that comply with the Supreme Court. Good luck with that. And, but I think that's really important. And there's all kinds of ramifications about the difference between what navigable waters are and what they're not. You look at the picture of the VDA, navigable. I can't even walk across it.
Go ahead, Bob.
And over there in our little neck of the woods, we have done some of this. And a lot of it is to help spread out that high water on that seasonal flow across that bench, and helps bring the healthiness back to that watershed instead of, so that it's an extremely valuable tool from the conservation side. And plus it does give a watering spot, whether it be seasonal, to the agricultural side. So it is a good tool to be out there and being used.
Mr. Chairman, I would also say that I think, you know, pursuing some sort of a bill that addresses the issue related to navigable waters is one thing, but I still think we can move forward with a conversation with the Game and Fish, Department of Ag, and the Corps of Engineers in terms of what's the appropriateness of the 500 linear foot. And so perhaps more of them can be a certified categorical exclusion as opposed to getting an individual certification under the 401 process.
So then just follow up on that comment. What can we do to facilitate that?
As far as having the meeting amongst the agencies, I think, we're committed to doing that. I've already had conversations with the staff in the division about having those conversations and taking a look at how many of these have gone through the individual process, and of those, how many of those have been a problem, and does that warrant change of that distance of 500 linear feet? Maybe it's 700, I don't know, but based on, we've had 15 years of experience. So let's look at that experience and see if we can make some adjustments and justify it.
So Chad, my question is is this something that the governor office may be interested in spearheading or at least directing the agencies to proceed forthwith with it? So that if there's any timely legislation that's needed or the importance of it, I mean, if it's a chief executive's directive, it'll have more turf to run on.
Absolutely. Be happy to come alongside that effort.
Okay, great.
That's all I have.
We are at discussed this morning.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, we have Jim McGagna online, so I'll bring him in.
Got a few more minutes for Jim.
You can go whenever you're ready.
Mr. Chairman?
We can hear you, Jim. Go ahead, please
Okay.
proceed.
Thank you for the discussion on this issue. We appreciate your taking it up, and particularly want to thank Director of DEQ for offering to take some steps forward on this. Just a couple of brief comments. Once the word was out that this was an issue that we had raised some concerns with, I've been contacted rather broadly from across the state, in particular by conservation districts who are very engaged in this type of work, and with these very small beaver dam analogs that have expressed the same frustration that I originally heard up in Northeast Wyoming, which led to the letter that I submitted to you. So I think it is an issue with some broad implications across the state. Mr. Chairman, in response to your comment, I certainly agree that many of us spent many years getting rid of beaver dams, and we've now come to realize, particularly with years of drought and that, the value of some of these smaller projects in just controlling the flow of water, replenishing soil moisture by holding that water back a little bit, as well as avoiding extensive and extreme spring runoffs and then a lack of water 2 months later. So I think the beaver dam analogs have come to be pretty widely accepted in a lot of the landowner community and with some of the federal agencies, as well as tools to be utilized today. I would just bring up one point, and I think I addressed it briefly in my letter, but the state engineer also plays a role in this. And I've not visited with the state engineer, but it's my understanding from some of those I've visited with that part of the process is also rather complex, and that the state engineer has actually had a memo apparently or supposedly drafted to address this that hasn't moved forward. So I would simply urge that as the governor's office and or DEQ and others move forward with this, that the state engineer be brought into this discussion as well, so that we can, to the extent possible, make this a process that works smoothly across more than one agency. I certainly recognize that may not be a lot we can do about the constraints that are imposed at the federal level, but at least make the state's portion of this be as all inclusive as possible, and work together as smoothly as possible. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to take any questions or just appreciate seeing this issue move forward. If it does come before the Joint Ag Committee, we'll certainly be pleased to provide additional information to that committee.
Questions for Todd? Jim, I mean. Jim and or Todd. Todd, any questions for Jim? Okay. I don't see any questions. Jim, thank you for your testimony and for following up with the letter.
Okay, thank you.
And as you proceed with it, it's abreast if it's going in the right direction or the wrong direction.
I'll certainly do that, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, now any other public comment on what has we've done this morning so far? Anything else, Hank?
Mr. Chairman, I think as you recall, the agenda was changed, I believe last week to add the Office of State Lands Investments to the agenda under this topic, and they're here. So I don't know if you
Yeah,
wanted to bring
we'll
them
take a
up.
break first and then
Okay.
we'll hit that. Is that all right, Jennifer? Okay. All right, we'll take a short break. We'll be back at 10 or 5 to 11. Okay, we are back. We're gonna jump topics briefly here because we've got the OLSLI here and has a schedule that we need to accommodate. So Jennifer, welcome. Good to see you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You bet. Please
Excuse-
proceed.
And thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for accommodating my schedule today. It's very busy. I'm Jennifer Scoggin. I'm the Director for the Office of State Lands and Investments. It's my understanding that you all would like to discuss staffing issues at OSLI and some of our processes as well. I've brought Deputy Director Jason Crowder. He is our process expert. So hopefully we can answer any questions you might have on our processes. But first, to start off with, it's my understanding that the committee may have that some concerns may have been related to the committee about OSLI's inability to process certain types of authorizations for use of state lands or, in a timely manner. And of course, that was concerning to me. So I immediately talked with some of the staff to figure out, what's going on. Is this a trend? What's happening? We had heard off and on throughout the COVID that people they'd had some difficulties with timely processing, but that was to be expected. In talking with our current staff, they were not able to think of any, at least recent examples of our difficulty in processing permit applications or special use leases or easement applications or anything like that. In fact, they looked at the oldest application we have in-house right now is still dated 2023. We have had, like I said, some of these struggles in the past. Part of it, when we've had longer turnaround times, have been due to perhaps there's an appraisal that's needed. And our appraisal team, we've had some turnover there, which meant that appraisals they weren't complete. There was like a 3-month backup. Now we're back on track. Most appraisals are taking 4 to 6 weeks if we need an appraisal. So we are seeing some of these things are starting to level out, particularly as we've been able to hire in key positions. Also, I would point out that sometimes what takes time with processing applications is we don't necessarily receive a full and complete application. There may be something missing, like somebody forgot their payment or their percentage of the easement amount that might be due. And we've been so busy that, we try to reach out and let people know that they have a deficient application and here's what we need from you. But we're not always going to bird dog it because we just don't have the staff to do it. So it may go into another pile. The exception to that being agricultural and grazing leases, because there are some with renewals, there are some times there. So what I wanted to at least make the committee aware of is we understand that we have been deficient in staff for some time. And so we do have plans to address it, and we are currently addressing it. After some of the significant budget reductions statewide or enterprise-wide, we were kind of left lean and mean, very few staff. We had 1-person program managers, and that's largely how we continue to roll, if you will, in land management. So we have 1 person that deals with all the easement applications. We have 1 person that deals with all the temporary use permit applications, 1 person that deals with the special use leases. And until recently, we had 1 person that did all of the grazing and agricultural leasing. And when you're renewing 400 grazing leases every year, that gets to be a lot. We had a lot of turnover, particularly in the grazing and agricultural leasing, because of burnout. When you've got single people handling every issue with each of those types of applications, it's a big job. And so people move on. So we talked internally and we tried to figure out how could we address some of the problems that go along with 1-person program managers. And we thought, well, let's look at building some teams. And so our idea being that we would have a number of entry-level people, like 2 working in grazing and agricultural leasing, and then have a more senior staff member over them. The idea, this is an example, the idea being that it would allow the entry level folks to process the day-to-day paperwork and answer easy questions and things like that to keep the day-to-day going. And that would free up the more senior staff member to address the more difficult questions, to kind of run to ground those issues that applicants may be having, and to also focus on new and different things that are coming down the pike. So one of the teams we developed is the agricultural team. The other team that we are developing is the sort of commercial leasing team. And that would be to have folks underneath a more senior level person. But the more junior people are processing the day-to-days of the special use leases, the easements, those sorts of things. Again, freeing up the more senior staff member to take on all those new things that we're having opportunities to take advantage of, such as pore space leasing. You know, we did put together a pore space lease and have been able to take advantage of that opportunity, but that hasn't been without significant sacrifice and reprioritizing things to allow bandwidth. We just simply don't have staff with bandwidth to take on a lot of these things. So we went to the legislature this year, 2023, and we asked for a number of positions. We asked for and were successful in getting the an entry level grazing and agricultural leasing position, as I mentioned. We were also successful in getting 2 GIS positions in our field services division. One is a geospatial technology analyst who does with mapping. The other is more of a records and data management analyst. One of the things that helps when you don't have a lot of people is you've got to have good databases. You've got to have good computer technology. You've got to have access to that. But in order for it to be effective, it has to be we have to keep making sure that the data is accurate, that the mapping is accurate. So we were successful in getting those 2 positions. And then we were also successful in getting a public information officer / policy person. We've had difficulty with communicating, especially with changes in statutes that require changes to rules. We wanted to be more proactive in letting people know what's going on. We also want to be more proactive in letting people know the good things that are going on at OSLI and with land management, excuse me. Plus, we also have to remember we have the financial services folks who've been dealing with all of the ARPA grants and loans and the CARES Act and all of that too. And so a policy person would be helpful for us, as well as, you know, PIO, those skill sets for communication. Policy person can also help with some things that Jason and I are doing, such as sage grouse mitigation banking. You know, that's a task that the legislature gave us. We don't have a person to do that. It's not a full-time need, but when it occurs, it's Jason and I that are working on the helping those bank applications through the process. So it'll be good to have somebody who's knowledgeable in land management and policy. So those were the 4 positions we were successful in getting in 2023. We have hired the entry-level grazing and agricultural leasing person. We have hired the 2 GIS people. We are in the interview process, if you will, for the policy PIO person. This year, continuing on with our team building, we're going to be going to the legislature to ask for a couple more positions. One would be another entry-level person for grazing and agricultural leasing. As I mentioned, that's a huge job. And then another commercial leasing person. That will be a lower or a more entry-level position. But we're also looking to reclassify a number of positions due to the increase in job complexities as we're kind of moving people around and moving jobs around. And then we're also asking for 1 grant and loan position. We're anticipating with the IIJA funds coming that we're going to need some help with that. And fortunately with that, we're hopeful that some of the set asides for the state revolving funds, the clean water and drinking water, will help pay for that position. So hopefully we will be successful in getting some of those positions. Again, that should hopefully free up some bandwidth so that we can even prioritize more proactive commercial revenue generating opportunities. That's been one of the things that we have wanted to do, haven't had the bandwidth to do. We've been doing the day-to-day activities as best we can. Even if we need to hire some consultants to help, we're hopeful that hiring these or that we receive these additional positions, which will free up some of the more senior staff to oversee any consultants that we might be successful in hiring or decide that we need to take a look at. I think the difficulty, as you might expect with, as I think is typical enterprise-wide, we have trouble keeping people. Our salaries don't always keep pace with the private sector, and people are looking for a lot of flexibility these days. People want to work from home. They want, compressed work schedules, 4/10s or Phoenix Fridays, and they're doing this to, in their own lives, have more of a balance and prevent the burnout too. The problem is when you're in a public facing agency like OSLI, you just can't have a lot of people working from home because there's a lot of communication that needs to go on with the applicants and the public, and also the hands-on, paperwork and the phone calls have to be made. And so while we try to be flexible and where possibilities exist and are warranted, we try to be a little bit flexible and allow people to telework maybe one day a week if their job is something that can do that, or we might allow a compressed work week once out of the month. But again, to do it on a consistent basis, which seems to be what the workforce is looking for, it's difficult for us to have those things happen. The other thing is we've managed to recruit and hire some really good people, and then they make other lifestyle changes, such as in our real estate analyst who does the exchanges and whatnot. After the COVID, we were able to hire somebody. It took us a while to get in applications with qualified applicants. We finally got a couple of them. We hired somebody, and after maybe a year, he departed to another state, wanted to make a lifestyle change. We then set about and we were able to finally get another qualified applicant. She was fantastic. She moved a lot of those land transactions that had just been sitting there. She moved them into a new status, and then she decided to go back to school. So now we're back to, I guess, one step forward, two steps back in our land transactions area. But we are trying to figure out how to do more with less, but we need help. We can't continue with the one-person program managers. It's just not effective. It's not working. We're not able to do all the things that we need to be doing with that. That's just sort of keeping the lights on and the day-to-day. And so, as I mentioned, we're putting into action our plan to at least deal with it initially, realizing that over time, should the legislature continue to ask us to pursue commercial development and things like that, we would like to put a solely commercial development team together. Other states have a lot more people in their state lands office. Like, for instance, Utah, I think they have similar acreage that we do, and they have 59 people. We have 15 that manage state lands in Wyoming. So big discrepancy there, but also they're doing a lot more proactively than we're able to do at this point. So with that, Mr. Chairman, that's kind of where we are with staffing issues, and be happy to take any questions. If people have questions about our any of our permitting processes or lease issuance or easements, Jason's here to answer that as well.
Thank you, Jennifer. We'll go to Representative Conrad. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a quick question, and there will be two of them. I'll start with the first one. You had 4 positions that were granted this year, correct? And 3 of those have been hired. So if I understood correctly from the math, what do you anticipate asking for the next budget session? Was that 3 or 4?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, we are asking for 3 positions for the budget session, and then we're asking to reclassify, is it 4 positions?
Thank you. Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Director Scoggins, if you were to, I guess, compile the difficulties in terms of recruiting and or position filling Is it a pay issue? Because if I recall correctly, we did raise the pay 8.5% this budget session. So if you had to divide it up, is it a pay issue or is it a lifestyle complexity?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, I would classify it really as both because we're seeing both. We have people who want lifestyle changes, but we also have people who are, at least in my experience, utilizing the entry-level positions as a way to come in and get a little bit of experience. And then we've worked them so hard, they burn out and then they move on. And, you know, they tell us flat out, hey, I can go make this amount if I go to the private sector and work for a real estate company or a contractor or something, and we just can't. We can't keep up with that, nor do we have the ability to reward high production employees, people who are really moving it and shaking it. We have no way to reward that to keep them either. So I would say it's a little of both.
And follow up finally. Director Scoggins, I think it's fair to state that the ability for the state to compete with private wages will probably never come together, right? I mean, we definitely know that. Obviously, wherever we're at, we see the private obviously pays more than state, but there are benefits on both sides. So what suggestion or two would you have for us as it relates to this disparity in terms of vacancy rates and people leaving?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, I think there's a sweet spot. I think that we have to continue to try to keep pace with inflation and things like that. Also, you know, it's difficult to find people that have the right skill set that sometimes want to live in Wyoming too. And so we do the best we can. I don't know what the answers are, but generally speaking, you know, the staff that we have, a lot of them in the more managerial roles are coming up through the agency as opposed to coming in from the outside. We've talked about ideas even with HRD about how can we even hire more the manager level folks, because they don't want to leave a private sector job and come to the state and not have the ability to bank vacation and sick leave and that sort of thing. They're starting from square one again. And so when we've tried to recruit some of these higher level folks, part of the reason is, well, you know, the pay, it's not too bad. It may not be what I'm doing now, but you know, the job sounds interesting to me, but what's really unacceptable to me is to have to start from square one with vacation and sick leave. So I've mentioned that to HRD and we've thought about, is there some way we can maybe incorporate that into recruiting these higher levels and maybe have some more success that way.
Mr. Chairman, Director Scoggins. I guess, so I think I'll just start off by saying the backlog of issues you had as it became land leases and such, I think it was an understatement. It was horrendous. And it was certainly testified to, and I'm glad to hear that you've made a lot of progress. So my question comes around as I'm confused. Now you say, we've cleaned this all up, everything is going great, but we need a whole lot more folks, which I'm not surprised government growing is anything new to me. So, and then you're dealing with challenges in the reality of where we live today with people moving and such. So do you have any data? I mean, real data, not just saying, you know, anecdotal, that, you know, things have gotten better. Something that went back a couple of years and just say where you're at today. And also justifying a need to expand government to do other things that you're currently not doing, you feel as well as you should. What is the cost benefit ratio for doing such a thing? I mean, I guess I heard it was bad. Now it's good. And now it's really kind of bad because we need a whole lot more folks. So I remain unconvinced that you need a whole lot more folks because I don't have any data. So if you could maybe that director.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Kolb, we can certainly work to put some data together for you. I didn't mean to imply that everything's fine now, that everything's rosy. We're trying to keep up. And so that's hence the request for the more entry level positions. We're trying to keep up. We've heard that people are upset. So it certainly isn't perfect, but in our role, we have a fiduciary duty to the trust beneficiaries to generate revenue, and largely for K through 12 education. Part of our, I guess the bulk of our revenue comes from oil and gas production on state lands, which shouldn't be surprising. In fact, it's what the high 80s, 88%, I think, comes from that. What we're trying to do and what we've been tasked with doing is to try to figure out a more normalized revenue stream. So it's not, so vulnerable in the boom bust time that comes with oil and gas. And so in order to not just kind of push the paper from day to day to do the daily tasks, in order to do that, in order to look at other commercial opportunities and ways to generate revenue, we need staff to do that. And so that's really what I'm saying is we need to get the day-to-day ironed out and then free up the bandwidth of some of the more senior folks to be able to pursue some of that. And it's been suggested to us that, we look at consultants and that kind of thing too. And certainly we want to do that, but it's our attempt to do what the board has tasked us with and with what the legislature has tasked us with, which is to normalize the stream of revenue for the trust beneficiaries. And we'd be happy to try to put some numbers together for you, Senator Colvin, to provide that to this committee.
Excuse me. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, I realize that State Land Office, OSLI, has been up to their armpits with alligators. But part of the task force purpose is to look at regulations. Have you had a chance to look at some of those regulations? Maybe it's because of legislative laws or whatever, and say, these just don't make sense. Or, if we tweak these here, I think we can do our job better. Did you have a chance to do that?
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Hamilton, we try to do that on a regular basis, such as when there are statutory changes that come down the pike, such as the cure period for agricultural leasing. We had Chapter 4 open and we were looking for things to streamline. And we've been criticized that some of our forms, we request too much information, but part of it is trying to have that balance of the fiduciary role, making sure we understand what's going on as we're managing state lands. And the interesting thing too is some of our processes aren't, I think it's just been like 40 years of doing it that way. And Jason, I don't know if you've thought about different ways to do it, but I'm sure there are ways we could streamline things. But we try to do that when we have a set of rules open, but that doesn't mean that we've been successful in every area.
Go ahead.
Chairman, this is a question maybe for both of you. Jason, Jennifer mentioned the Sage Grouse Bank. Could you explain that to everybody? What is that? What is that all about? Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, I'm trying to think of how many years ago it's been now, but the legislature, 2021, okay. They authorized sage grouse banking in the state of Wyoming. And typically if the bird gets listed, and this is for selling of credits to help offset, things like oil and gas development, things that harm their habitat. And so a number of, applicants in Wyoming have decided to put together a bank where essentially they're offsetting the impacts of industry and selling those credits to industry. I don't know how to explain it really easily, but in any event, there are statutes that allow a bank to get certified by the Board of Land Commissioners. And in order to do that, it's an effort of the CMOG, which is a group of Department of Ag, Game and Fish, OSLI, and I think the Land Trust, Bob Budd. And we evaluate the application in consultation with BLM and Fish and Wildlife Service to see if the bank that's being established meets the management and criteria to set up a bank so that these credits can be sold. And so it's kind of a complicated process, but OSLI is the point agency, if you will, for the applications as they come in. And so we're trying to coordinate with at least the 4 state agencies and the federal agencies in trying to move these applications through the process. And we have not successfully, other than Pathfinder certification, we have not successfully been able to bring one to fruition, but we are getting close on a couple of them. But it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of expertise. And I know I'm not explaining it very well. Jason, do you have anything to add? Or I think Mr. Budd will be here later. You can ask him. He's more versed in it than I am.
Just a quick follow-up. Who are the applicants? I mean, is this primarily oil and gas? Is it like carbon credits? I'm pretty ignorant on the whole sage-grouse credit bank. Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Ide, these banks that are being established are generally, I think our applicants are ranching or ranchers who have agreed to, they happen to have on their ranch sage-grouse habitat, and they're willing to manage for that sage-grouse habitat, to put a conservation easement on it so that things can't be done. The oil and gas companies come in and buy credits from them, and I don't know how they figure out how many credits an activity is worth, but they work with Game and Fish and whoever. But it's industry buying the credits from the bank, and the bank, at least the ones that we have been established on various ranches, or they're trying to establish them on ranches in Wyoming.
The Appropriations Committee has asked the executive branch to make a presentation to JAC in October and provide a write-up of that whole process. And so we'll be able to take a deeper dive if you stay tuned.
No, you go.
Go ahead.
I'll go with that. Let you bring it home. Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. Back to you on these 4 positions that we filled, 3 we filled and 1 we're interviewing. Can you kind of give me a flavor? How many applications total did we have for those positions? And how many did we bring into interview? How many didn't make the cut? Just to kind of get an idea. I want to try to get an idea. Too, it's been mentioned before, we've worked really hard to raise salaries throughout the enterprise. So I just want to just kind of for my own edification here, see how that's going.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I can take that one. Typically for the lower level positions, we get 15 to 25 applications for those, which is a fair amount. The ones that we'd like to bring in and have additional conversations and interview, that's less than 5. There's a lot of folks who are just placing applications because that could be a requirement of some other federal funding that they're getting. It's part of the process. They just don't come to the table with the qualifications and experience that we're looking for in those lower level things. And so we're kind of stuck with that age-old problem. Do you get somebody who's really qualified? Do you sit there and you wait for them to show up, or do you put a butt in the seat, for lack of a better word, and try to train them to be something, to pull something out of them to be a qualified and productive member of the team? So that's roughly where it is. When we get to the higher level positions, much less, probably 5 applications, 5 to 10 in total, maybe 1 we'd like to bring in. But this is an extreme contrast to where we were prior to the COVID pandemic, when we were getting 40 to 50 applications, and we were able to have a really bad problem of which one of these 10 or 15 can we bring in to hire, and then which one of the 5 you'd have a great applicant in any of the 5 that you came to the end of that process with. But we're not at that point anymore.
Mr. Chairman, and for the task force, I know, regulatory reduction task force is what we're doing, but I truly believe that some of this is cultural, and some of the changes that I think would help us maybe aren't necessarily all in statute, but how staff looks at things when they come in the door. How overworked are they? So they come in, the person comes in the door at 4:30 and it's just like, I'm going to say no to them just because I'm tired and want to get the heck out of here, because they're just overworked, and they're the burnout factor that the director just talked about. So that's why I'm asking these questions, try to ferret that out to see how much of this how much can we change in the culture? And so I do have one just last question before I turn it over to the boss. But you stated before, and I want to make sure I understand it, said that right now, every application that you've got in front of you is dated 2023. Could you just elaborate on that? Exactly what is that? What is that pile that you were to explain that to me? Just flesh it out a little bit for me, because I want to make sure I understand. Thanks.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Co-Chair, when I asked my staff if we were seeing issues of 2 and 3 years to process something, they went back and looked at what's on their desk, and that would be easements, temporary use permit applications, special use leases, special use leases, and everything, nothing was dated prior to 2023. Now, that's not to say that they have everything processed and everything's rolling forward. It just means that they don't have old stale applications sitting there. At least that's what they're telling me. I do understand from our easement program manager that the number of easement applications is down a little bit. And so she's been able to keep up with the processing of those. However, our TUPs, I understand that those are backlogged. And so our program manager is working to address that backlog, and the backlog was created largely because we've had some staff turnover in that position, but that's what they're telling me, nothing earlier than 2023.
Thanks for being here, Jennifer. I had a couple of things that I was thinking about and what I wanted to address with you. And one of them is you're the point person on dealing with these various agencies about access to be able to perform a duty or a job if you're a contractor. And what happens in Wyoming, we have a very short season. You know, we can get started maybe in April, May, and then, you know, maybe go to September, October, depending on the weather. Well, these STIPs come in and personally, I'm involved in a situation where we can't really do anything till August 1st. And we got to shut down like in November. So imagine putting yourself in a position you're trying to find people, if you can even find the people, to work for 3 months, and then you're going to cut them loose. Do you keep them all year round? I mean, there's got to be a way we can work out some kind of stipulations in these areas where we're not disturbing the sage grouse. The wildlife corridors are not an issue, yet we can't get out there and go to work. So maybe there's something you as a lead person in that, working with the other agencies, can help all these contractors out so they can get out there and do their job. It's really a problem, and it's a big problem. And, you know, you look at the Pinedale Anticline, you know, trying to drill those those gas wells out there, and they have to be shut down, half, 2/3 of the year as well. Just creates, you know, you got safety issues, all kinds of things going on. What can we do as a state to try to help in that regard?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Bebout, that's a really good question, because I have heard that problem from the oil and gas industry, that sometimes it takes us long periods of time because we might, you know, to issue like a special use lease for oil and gas facilities, because we have to get an appraisal done, and sometimes appraisal staff is backed up or whatever. What we've tried to tell the oil and gas folks and others is, if you tell us your deadlines, we can reprioritize things and try to juggle things around to help you better meet your deadlines. But we are also open to any and all other suggestions to help with that. And certainly we'd be interested in hearing. I think also the oil and gas industry has said, hey, maybe we can hire you a person that's devoted to just the work that we need to have you do. I don't know what that would look like, but that really hasn't been pursued either.
Think about it. If you could figure out a way to work some stipulations and be able to hire these rigs for oil and gas, or smaller rigs like some of the rigs that I have, it would just be so beneficial to everybody. You know, you don't damage or destroy any of the environment. You're keeping your people working, and you get the job done, you know, on time, on budget. Really. So who would be the point person? Would that be your agency to do that? And maybe we need to put together something else to be able to try to rectify that, because it really is a big issue.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Beebe, it is a big issue and it's one that we wrestle with. We even wrestled with it a little bit yesterday. The stipulations that we have to place on leases are provided to us from those other agencies, as you've mentioned. But when we develop those stipulations, we are very much at the table arguing the case you're making, but from a fiduciary standpoint. We're reduced in our revenue generating ability because activities can't be done on the ground because of those timing stipulations. And that's the argument we make on a continual basis. The impact that you see is that you can't do your work and that your crews and everything else have the impacts that you've described. I think on state lands, we are the point person. The Board of Land Commissioners have the ability to put those stipulations on or not put those stipulations on. But it's because of actions by those other agencies, the executive orders that the governor's president passed have put on for those protective measures, put us in a box. And I guess my answer to your question is we are the point person for that. And we are at the table arguing for your benefit, but it's mostly from a revenue perspective that we need to have that as open as much as possible. Obviously do it in a responsible manner and do it with some guidelines that's important to do. But we argue that on a daily basis.
Mr. Chairman, for that, and we'll have more discussions, Jason, because that's just huge. The other question I have, Wyoming is blessed with so vast majority of minerals. We got all kinds of minerals. And lately, we're seeing a lot about gold. We got the gold mine going on down by Kurt Gowdy State Park. We've got precious minerals. We've got critical minerals. And so your leases, and you and I talked about this, Jennifer, a little bit ago, they'd say metallic, non-metallic. We talk about revenues. Maybe there's a way we could fix our leases so we could lease all these other minerals on our state lands. Because just sure as we're sitting here, there's deposits in Wyoming that could be mined and we need them. We need the critical minerals. We need that. We could mine them. So is there a way to change the lease? How do we say Wyoming, we're open for business for all these other minerals as well as, oil, gas, coal, uranium, those kinds of things. What could we do to help there? I think there's a lot of revenues that could be generated, jobs created. We could really move in that direction.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Bebout, I'm sorry, I misunderstood your first question. So Jason, clean that up for me. I thought you were talking about permitting, but with respect to this, our metallic, non-metallic lease is, it's kind of our catch-all, I guess. And so we've shoehorned a number of things into that. But you're correct. I think it would be prudent for us to develop leases that are specific to certain things, such as rare earths, such as gold, such as silver, whatever it is. The problem with our metallic, non-metallic leases, we haven't seen gold mining or anything like that in Wyoming. And so just to give you an example, so for the project that's west of Cheyenne, we had to use that lease template, but it didn't have anything in it really that's specific to royalties and what's appropriate royalties for gold. So we had to go educate ourselves and educate the board and talk to experts to figure that out and then kind of try to amend the lease, if you will, so that it would reflect the appropriate royalty rate even. So your point is well taken. I think that, and part of our strategy when we were talking about hiring, some of these entry-level positions to free up the more senior folks, their bandwidth, what we're hoping is that they can help us draft some of that, some of those specific leases, and that we have the time now to gain that expertise and information so that the leases properly reflect what's actually going on or the desired result that's going on the ground.
Director, often in private industry, we see this similar situation. You alluded that regulations and streamlining and maybe consolidating some of these. Have you considered a third party evaluating the agency and coming back with an action plan on how to move it forward? Very often in private industry, we see that, and changes can occur and advancements and efficiency does occur. Has that been considered?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Davis, I'm not sure that we've recently considered that. Jason, where the rules were looked at in with Bridget. weren't there some rule reductions done in, yeah, but that was not through a consultant, no. Pardon me, I was consulting with Jason, but to my knowledge, we have not done that. We have not looked to hire an expert to look at those rules and to make suggestions, but it's certainly something that we could look at.
The reason I brought that question up is if you watch reality TV, Bar Rescue, it does seem to work there.
Mr. Chairman, Director Scoggins. So we, as mentioned a little earlier, we are Regulatory Reduction Task Force, not hire more folks task force. I do understand the argument that more people might make it more streamlined and that way would improve things for everybody. But do you have anything you're willing to bring forward that's a regulatory reduction idea that would in fact help you possibly not having the staffing people that you do need or requesting, you know, as the conversation went? Do you have something you can offer up as a way of making your office run more efficiently? Less, however we can do this, you're the experts, it's your office. What do you have to offer when it comes to regulatory reduction? Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chairman, Senator Kolb, I think that's going to require us to go back and really take a hard look at that. Some of, excuse me, as I mentioned previously, some of our processes have been around for, you know, quite some time. And so they've been done that way a lot because that's how it's always been done. But I expect if we go back and look, that there might be some efficiencies that are to be had there, but I'm not prepared today to provide that, but certainly can put that together.
So just a follow up on that, Director. I think it would be useful, particularly when budget time comes around, to, if you can do two things. One is provide us a history of staffing levels of OSLI in the past and what you've lost and what you've gained. Just so we can see a lineup, you know, of, and then in conjunction with that, I think we also need to see how your responsibilities and obligations have changed or added responsibilities that require more employees or, you know, basically we want you to do more, but we want you to do more with less. And so we just need to see the lay of the landscape so that we can accommodate what you need. And at the same time, you know, if you are in fact understaffed, then we need a sufficient description of it, so we can say, oh yeah, it's simple, versus just big government versus little government. And then just take, for example, your idea of having an estate near us that has a commercial development entity or a, you know, group within your agency. To me, that's kind of a thing, because something like that would pay for itself. It would be self-funded. It would bring more revenues in, and it would maximize use of our state lands to where they should be. And so we're not really adding to government. We're just maximizing the value of the properties that we have and to use them in an efficient and proficient manner for the state of Wyoming. And so if you would put together, and you mentioned that the board is kind of directing you kind of in that direction as well. I think a proposal that addresses that type of an issue would be very receptive in appropriations and I think on the floor, because that's killing two birds with one stone. And it's so it'd be self-funded, but it improves how we use our lands and how we can maximize the properties that we already have. So now I want to go back to your staff, your vacancy issues. What's your current vacancy rate right now, or where are you sitting?
Mr. Chairman, if you include forestry with that, it's about 14%.
14 out of what's your total typical personnel?
109.
And so you're essentially 15, 16 positions short. And have you had an opportunity to experienced the benefits of the pay raises that the last two legislative meetings were, essentially overall, it bumped up anywhere between 8 to 15%. So has it made a difference, or is it?
Mr. Chairman, I think it has made a difference. It certainly made a difference morale wise within the agency. But I think people are still looking at inflation and all of those things and cutting back. And, some of those things we can't solve either. But it has helped, I think, internally with morale.
Changing topics a little bit. Have you heard back, or has anyone in the executive branch heard back on the folks that have the remaining checkerboard properties? Along the I-80 corridor? I know that earlier this summer, there was a blip on the screen. And it has have you been directed to inquire into that, to find out exactly who it is, what they're doing, or what's remaining, and valuations of those properties?
Mr. Chairman, yes, we have been asked to dialogue with Sweetwater Royalties, I believe is the company, to look at what they have and what they have available. There's been some mixed messages about what there is and what there isn't. And so we're looking at it and trying to put together a list of those things that we think might be interesting. But previously, I think we had a lot of people from different agencies also looking.
We've all heard different rumors. Some of them say no, not selling any mineral. Some of them say, yeah, we'll negotiate it. And certain lands are off and on. So is there a timing with your working with Sweetwater folks of when you're going to have something to put together that you can present basically to the legislature at some point in time?
Mr. Chairman, there is not a specific date at this point. We are looking at it, but we're not ready to move forward yet either. There's a lot to consider.
Yeah. So my point is that there's if anything requires legislative action, we're going to have something before the session. And so I think it would be useful to relate that type of thing to them, because if they have a real interest, that's the only way it's going to happen. So, and if you could keep the Appropriations Committee updated on it, I think it would be, and then at some point, we probably want to get it briefed, whether it's in camera or not in camera, to find out where things are headed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay. Any other questions for Jennifer or Jason? Okay, any other public comments on Jennifer's presentation? So let's jump back into our agenda then. Thank you very much, Jennifer and Jason, for being here. Thank you. If we go back to where the consideration of ag bills, I think that's where we are. But if we go back to our schedule, and we've got the Dairy Marketing Act repeal. Doug, I think we should be able to get through these two fairly quickly. So see if we can't knock those out before we adjourn for lunch. All right.
Mr. Chairman, members of the task force, Talise Hansen, LSO. I'm presenting Bill Draft 24 LSO 204 on the Wyoming Dairy Marketing Act. This bill draft was requested at the Task Force Agriculture Working Group meeting. This bill draft repeals the Wyoming Dairy Marketing Act of 1971. Section 1 repeals Wyoming statutes 1136-101 through 1136-110, and Section 2 provides an effective date of July 1, 2024. And I'll stand for any questions.
Doug, you want to explain to us how this came up? What's the need for it? What impact it has if we remove it in terms of any regulatory, federal or state regulatory issues?
Be happy to, Mr. Chairman. So this came about kind of the base question that Ken just asked the previous group, which was, do you notice any silly or unnecessary, statutes that exist that are no longer necessary? We were able to identify 2 of those in digging through ours. And this is the first one. So there is a federal milk marketing order as well. We don't have the dairy presence that we did in the early 70s in Wyoming. And since that time, there's a federal milk marketing order that that essentially takes care of the dairy producers and processors in Wyoming for the existing market. So we haven't used this in, I couldn't tell you when the last time was, but it hasn't been any time in the last several decades that that we've used this. And then looking at it from my standpoint, for me as a director to wade in and try to set dairy prices for producers and processors in Wyoming today, given that we've only got 5 of them, doesn't make any sense. And so this is one of them that just has been idle forever, and one that we thought could help clean up our process and get it off the books.
Okay, any questions for Doug about it? So Doug, has this been run through ag yet?
It has not. I brought it up here first, and I haven't talked about it with them.
And so does ag meet between now and the end of?
They do.
They do. Go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chairman. I know that you and I discussed that once we kind of flush some of these out, that we get with the chairs of the various committees that they go to and talk, but I happen to be calling our Senate Chair of Agriculture on another matter. And so I kind of tipped her off to both of these bills and just said, just ask, I said, I know you're just catching you cold, but these, and talked about just what the director talked about. And about these bills, and just said, would you be receptive to taking them at their meeting? I believe it's October, end of October, I think, in ag. And she said that she'd be glad to bring them forward and take a look at them. She didn't agree to the disposition of them from the committee, because I now got a committee member sitting right next to me, so I wouldn't want to presume anything, but she said that she'd be glad to take them out. So we did ask, and then said that we'd be following up with it.
Yes, Doug, I think the question. The question is, what happens if you? Expertise to really know. I would just think that if they only have one meeting to review these 2 bills, there would probably need to be, 1 or 2 write-up from your agency that breaks all of the potential issues down. And then I would also suggest that that we direct these bills to them, and so that they can kind of pre-work them through their and have at least the 2 respective chairs analyze and ask the questions that they would like to have asked and answered if these came up in their agenda in October. I mean, that's what I would do. So I presume that they would do the same thing.
Understood.
I mean, like I say, we're relying, obviously, I don't know who else has actually looked at the statutes, but when I look at them, those concerns just come up. So.
Yes,
It looks like a good idea.
We had some rationale that our manager of our Consumer Health Services Division did an initial write-up of review of potential regulatory reductions. We still have those on hand, and the clarification about how the process goes forward through this task force on to the Ag Committee is appreciated. I'll do exactly that. I can provide the brief and make sure that that's appropriate in the agenda for the next interim joint ag meeting, and address it that way.
Yeah. So what I envision, if we have a favorable vote, we'll probably vote on these 2 today to recommend them that they proceed to the Ag Committee with sufficient information provided to them prior to their meeting, so that they can address them in a productive fashion. That's what I anticipate could happen.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. And to directly answer your question, Mr. Chairman, I don't see any impact of repealing the Wyoming milk marketing order.
Well, we appreciate you bringing them forward, and I mean, this is how we're getting the ball rolling on getting rid of some statutes, so. Go ahead, John.
Director, I guess I'd be interested to know if there's anything that would cause us an issue to say reenact such statute if it was to be repealed. Is it, can we just, if we find out there's some need for it in the future that we couldn't possibly foresee today, do we do us harm by removing it? I'd certainly like to know if that's a potential possibility. And also I look forward to the reduction of your FTE staff by reducing the statutes, and I appreciate your work, Director.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Senator, yeah, I think that I can't foresee a reason why we would need to reenact given the status of dairy marketing today. We're just such a small player compared to where it once was, that the need for price protections for our producers is sufficiently covered by that federal milk marketing order. Not to say it couldn't happen. If it did, there wouldn't be anything that could prevent the state from going ahead and modernizing and recreating if needed. In terms of staff, if you take a look at the historic staffing levels of the Department of Ag, we're as low as we've been.
Chairman, Director, that was a joke. I'm sorry I came across anything differently.
Should be used to it by now. And then, Mr. Chairman, with your permission, the other one is fairly simple as well. This one is for flow through pools, and so it applies to hot springs. And so you have these facilities that are built essentially in riparian areas of live rivers and take advantage of alluvial flows and hot spring heating of that water. And that water is not treated in any way. So a certificate for a pool, a public, swimming pool, would indicate that there's some level of water quality assurance that's in there, or some level of safety that's implied through inspection of the Department of Ag. And that's not something that we can really provide for flow through pools. But I don't know if I'm out of order here.
Okay.
So it was just another one of those regulations that we were taking a look at and saying, well, we're going in there and we're looking at, say, the spacing of lifeguard stands or where the hose bibs are in a building that may or may not exist to support that flow through pool. And we're looking at, condition of a deck when you've got people recreating that are not part of the pool. They're just out in the river. There's no oversight for safety just a few feet away. But because this is an establishment, we seem to be indicating that there's some level of protection that we can't really provide. And we certainly can't do anything with the water quality. And it's just one of those areas for flow through pools where we thought those are specific enough to the river systems that they're situated next to, that the locals would probably be a more appropriate entity for oversight of any safety measures that they want to have in place for that facility more than we would be.
So Doug, how many of these exist, and how many are, and give us you've got Thermopolis, but I presume that's different, because there's a few flow through pools, I think, adjacent to the river, but most of them are not. But then you've got Granite Hot Springs, you've got all these other ones that are out there, and just let's describe what this specifically relates to and how many there are.
Mr. Chairman, can I phone a friend?
Sure.
Justin, how many of those flow through facilities are there? I was thinking of Thermopolis and Saratoga as being the primary locations for these flow through pools, but there's a handful of them, I think.
Chairman, Director, approximately 5 to 7, sir, across the state. 5 to 7, sir, approximately.
So what are they?
There's two in Saratoga, there's Thermopolis, Astoria Hot Springs, and Granite Hot Springs are the ones that I can think of off the top of my head.
And so the flow throughs though, they're different than say like the Star Plunge or the TP Spa because that, I presume, because those have buildings, they have it's naturally water coming out of the ground, but they're not really adjacent to the river. That's my question is.
Mr. Chairman, those would be considered a flow through pool, except for that one slide area in the back, which is chlorinated and has a circulation system attached to it.
So how much regulation do you provide in Thermopolis to those 3 or 4 pools that are there, the larger ones?
Mr. Chairman, we inspect those on a regular basis and we do verifications to ensure that they've cleaned the decks, they've cleaned the pool. We can't do much with turbidity. We don't have any involvement with sanitation, but we do look at the life-saving equipment such as shepherd's hooks or flotation devices for rescue.
So how would this impact your review of the larger pools in Thermopolis?
This would turn it over to the local municipality to make those judgment calls on what regulations for safety that they would need.
Okay, go ahead, John.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question on those. There's a flow through body up there out of Bondurant on going up Jackson, up 191. Back in there, it's just a pool up there, and I believe there's flow through areas back. It's very far in. I mean, it's back in there a ways. Can't even describe it. I mean, I've been there, but do you inspect those type of facilities up there where the hot springs are? And if so, do you drive all the way out there to do this? I mean, what kind of impact does it have on your budget? You know, going out to these remote locations when you really don't have much of an impact on what they're doing. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, I'm not aware of that particular hot springs or pool. If it's not associated to a physical facility that's been put around it, which kind of encompasses or cages in that water that flows through that allows for cleaning. If it's just a natural flow through pool that's out in nature, we don't do anything with that, nor do we do any sort of inspection for those.
Hey, further questions? Further questions? Seeing none, any public comment on these 2 particular bills? Okay, we'll close public comment. Do we have entertain a motion on any recommendations on these 2 bills? Go ahead.
Motion that we recommend these be forwarded to the appropriate committee, I believe in this case, Ag.
Move in second. Any discussion? All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? That motion carries. Hank, is that anything else?
Mr. Chairman, the only thing I would say you could consider is since this is a final vote on a bill by the task force, at least I know they have to be forwarded to the Ag Committee per the motion.
So a roll call?
If you would like to do a roll call vote, and I would separate those out by bill.
Go
Okay.
ahead.
Mr. Chairman, this is a roll call vote on 24 LSO 0204 to be forwarded to the Agriculture Committee. Senator Ide.
Aye.
Senator Kolb.
Aye.
Representative Conrad.
Aye.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Director Matthews. Director Miyamoto. Director Parfit.
Aye.
Mr. Barron.
Aye.
Mr. Bebout.
Aye.
Ms. Delancey.
Aye.
Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Martin.
Aye.
Ms. Olson.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Grew.
Aye.
Chairman Nicholas.
Aye.
Mr.
Thank you.
Chairman, that first one passes by a vote of 15-0, and the second one is 24. The second one is a vote on 24 LSO 0205 to be forwarded to the Agriculture Committee. Senator Ide. Senator Kolb.
Aye.
Representative Conrad.
Aye.
Representative Davis.
Aye.
Director Matthews.
Aye.
Director Miyamoto. Director Parfit.
Aye.
Mr. Barron.
Aye.
Mr. Bebout.
Aye.
Ms. Delancey.
Aye.
Mr. Hamilton. Mr. Martin.
Aye.
Ms. Olson.
Aye.
Co-Chairman Grew.
Aye.
Chairman Nicholas.
Aye.
Mr. Chairman, that bill also passes on a vote of 15-0 of the task force.
Okay, thank you very much. It's now a few minutes after 12. We're currently scheduled to come back at 1:30. And the question is, do we want to come back at 1 or do you want to come back at 1:30? I mean, in terms of it's just your pleasure. Let's shoot for 1 o'clock. That way we'll move things on and if we can get more done, we'll get more done. We'll stand in recess till 1 o'clock.